when you want to do this, you got to keep in mind what your environment's like. Do you have a hybrid environment or a cloud environment? Do you have assets that you can put agents on, or are you really, is a lot of your network IoT or OT devices? So I would say pros and cons of each one when it comes to your implementation.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely would agree with that. So to kind of jump back now to ZTNA and understanding ZTNA, because microsegmentation is, a small part of that. I think ZTNA has definitely been a buzzword as of recently. And I think, there's a lot of maybe mismarketing out in the world that's telling people, it's not a product. It's not like I go buy a big box off of the shelf and now I have ZTNA. I appreciate the fact that a lot of companies will word this as a ZTNA journey, because it really is. It's not. It is not one piece. It is not one component. You don't go out and buy one piece of software. So, this next slide I kind of talk through, and maybe we can talk through together like some of the components on the ZTNA journey. So, there's user and system side of things. So here's that classic user VPN replacement that we just spoke about. So next on that is just like you talked about, that device health enforcement. We have MFA from anywhere, granular access control. We have triggered MFA. So do you want to talk a little bit about triggered MFA? I think that would be good to hear from you. Like, I know not everybody might know what the triggered MFA necessarily means. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, one of the use cases that I think of is there's certain solutions that if you're going to certain assets, then you've got a triggered MFA versus your traditional MFA. So it kind of depends on what assets you're going to, and I know there's definitely some zero trust platforms that you actually can, through the microsegmentation, you can kick off the MFA. So it's saying, hey, you want to go here. This is a little different from your traditional apps that you did with in the beginning. So we're going to actually kick off the zero trust, the multi-factor authentication that way. That's what I'm thinking of, and that's kind of from my world and what I'm looking at.
Yeah, definitely. I think the use case for triggered MFA as well is it allows you to put MFA parameters on some legacy applications that may, through that microsegmentation route that you've talked about, it allows you to put triggered MFA on applications that historically may not have supported MFA because you're not utilizing the application. You're maybe utilizing access to the storage or the database of that application, or access to the network segment of that application, or access to execute that application's runtime as the MFA trigger for it.
And I think the more we get into it, the more we'll be able to do that as we're equating risk, right? We're doing it at application levels right now. If you think about it, you log into your bank, depending on the device you're using and your credentials, you might get multi-factor, you might not. Hopefully, if it's smart enough, it'll say, "Oh, I recognize all of you. I'm not gonna do the step-up authentication." But if I don't, then I will. Imagine being able to do that within a network. So the more you look at risk as you're moving across the network, the more you can kind of do a step up as you're trying to access different applications within your environment. And I would expect to see that as kind of a response to some of these more sophisticated attacks.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes around that contextual driven access as well. And so this is kind of where the initial journey tends to start, with these kind of couple items. And then I see it kind of generally diverge into two separate trees. We see a continuation of user-based access. Then this is where we get into that system level. So we have, the east-west controls that you've talked about, that microsegmentation, metadata-driven access, and here's that secure of that IoT, OT networks. I think these tend to east-west controls and secure IoTs tend to kind of be lumped together, just because they generally are accomplished with the same pieces of software in place. And then we've got that securing container. So whether that's Kubernetes, whether that's AWS, whether that's Azure Functions, whatever the case may be.
Right.
And then, we come back on the user side and look at API-based risk deployment, ITSM ticket-driven access, SAML-based authentication, and the kind of pie in the sky for everybody else, which is real-time, all of this data real-time integrated into IDS, IPS, MDR. And I think this is really where that ZTNA journey reconverges back with that security journey. Now, all of this protection that we're putting in place is really bisecting with the solutions that we have in place that we're then monitoring. So we're, taking SIEM remediation action on these types of situations. So now we're going back and saying, okay, when a triggered MFA occurs and a user can't authenticate, do we throw an error and lock their account based on like a SIEM SOAR action? And
Right.
I think that's where we see this convergence back with the security. And this goes back to what we talked about the past 2 weeks, the past 2 week sessions prior, is really around. I know we get into the weeds on all of these acronyms, but this really is where this comes back into like security automation and the secure log ingest and things like that really allow us to make some pretty granular decisions on what's going on inside of the infrastructure in a pretty quick succession, just based on the context clues that we're receiving from all of these security measures that we have in place.
Yeah, and you mentioned a great automation. As we're adding all these points, if someone's kind of looking at this, they're like, that's more overhead, that's more level of effort, that's more people, that's more solutions, and it's so critical to be investing in solutions that can take some of that level of effort away from your security team or your network team by adding in automation, by learning behaviors so that things can trigger without having to have someone eyes on all the time looking at events, because event exhaustion is very real. And so
Alert fatigue.
Yeah, exactly. So as we're adding all this, I don't think we would be able to do this as well as we are today if it wasn't for a lot of the machine learning. And I'm expecting a lot of this to get a lot easier as that starts to mature. Machine learning's been out there for quite some time, but generative AI, I'm seeing that making things easier so that, you don't have to learn a certain way to query your code. We can actually make very complex things very simple, and helping out security teams so that they don't have to be absolute experts and have to hit this every single day to understand how to, it's not a regex rule that we're trying to, write, which is very complicated. It should be very easy to implement.
Yeah, I think while the rest of the world is sitting here holding their breath, watching all these LLMs and thinking that they're very interesting, I think a lot of, from the engineering side, Sean, I think a lot of our brains are looking at LAM, large action model,
Right.
and how that differs. It's just like what it sounds like. Large language model is these, complex language models that you can ask questions and get normalized responses out of. But the large action model is reviewing this information and taking action on them, real human-like actions based on what's occurring inside of the environment. In the same way, a security expert would kind of critically think and look at all the data and then take an action across platforms. I think it's also safe to say, Sean, like, as somebody looks at maybe, what it is, almost a dozen and a half bullet points here on this chart, and then they think about, they also have a EDR, MDR, maybe they have a PAM solution, maybe they have a SIEM solution that maybe does SOAR or a log ingest. But I think it's pretty safe to say that across this all, there's many vendors that are doing one or both sides of this, both the ZTNA and the security side. I think this is not something where you have to go, I need, somebody doesn't, I don't want anybody to look at this diagram and think they need some sort of product to check off each one of these dots. A lot of the solutions that are out there definitely incorporate many, if not all of these, and then even into the security side of things as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I look at several of these and I'm like, okay, are the microsegmentation can actually solve, three or four of these. It's definitely not everything, right? So you're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to solve everything with a single solution. But I think what we're seeing now, especially with security vendors, is designing platforms so that, I know it's something that we're doing, which is, being able to provide a single console, a single agent, a single policy for a lot of this, so that it makes it easier. So you're not having to go into different point solutions. You have a platform that you can utilize to roll that out, and I think that's going to help make it easier. And I think that's why we're seeing kind of a vendor consolidation into vendors that are able to provide kind of that uniform platform or unified platform to make it easier to implement. Because you're right, this is, if you had a point solution for every single one of these, that's really complex. It's really difficult. So as security vendors, we're trying to make that a lot easier by kind of putting that into a platform that makes it easier to kind of implement.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with that, I'm sure there's customers on this call today that are might be a little swimming, going, hey, where do I start? How do I understand where I need to go with this? Um, so let's kind of, I mean, talk about, maybe a simple checklist. And it certainly includes some of those items that are off of there. But, you know, getting a start on ZTNA, I think we can probably agree that most of this stuff on here is generally on the starting checklist for ZTNA. But Sean, what do you see as like low hanging fruit? The first couple, and I know everybody would want to follow generally that hierarchy that I just showed in the last slide, but we know that that's not, business isn't built off of follow these dots on a plot point chart. What do you see the most, I guess I hate to use the term bang for your buck, but where do you see the most impact to the business around its security, in terms of some of these things that would be considered traveling towards the ZTNA journey?
So there's definitely a lot of ways to kind of to look at that. You can do risk analysis. You can look at something like a MITRE attack framework to really kind of understand how the attacks are working. So I don't want to say like there's kind of certain things that every company could take advantage of, but I will say there's definitely some that are probably more obvious. Multi-factor single sign-on is going to address the credential issue that we're seeing now, if it's implemented correctly, and prevent that if I have credentials, I can get into the network. So that's one. I think the zero trust network access solution that replaces the VPN checks a lot of these. So having a single solution that does replace the VPN, can do multi-factor authentication, can do device and health enforcement checks, and can limit. I think that I know I saw it on there, limiting the applications that an individual can access. I think that's a great place to start. Multi-factor, if you're doing it kind of on a side, is usually something that, I mean, it just checks off so many. When it comes to perimeter defense, it checks off so many scenarios, such as that social engineering I mentioned, and phishing, and it solves those problems very quickly. So those are the things I would say make a lot of sense, because some of those solutions actually check a lot of these. So I would say that would be the kind of the first place I would go.
Sean tended to diverge the conversation a little bit. I'm a pretty big evangelist for passwordless security tokens. I know that's on the list. It's probably one that I think is scarier to maybe, what us as system admins and engineers have classically thought, which is like this thing is secure because we have a long password that we put in for it. But, to diverge the conversation a little bit, like what's your thoughts on passwordless implementation? I know there's more and more companies that are going to that implementation. I think the big cloud providers, GCP, Azure, AWS all support it, and then from that side, they're kind of the business applications, whether that's Google Apps for Business or Office 365, are now supporting this password environment. And even to the point where like we have these all the maybe we're managing, before it was I have one 2FA token or MFA token, and now it's very easy for a user to have 10, 12 MFA tokens across their accounts, especially if we haven't looked at something like an SSO implementation. I know you guys at Akamai have an MFA solution that kind of streamlines that process, or you think like maybe an Okta or a P2 license for Office 365 can do some of that SSO. But even I know now that those security keys are also capable of including those SSO or those MFA tokens. And so that it's easy, lose a device. Now I'm not resetting all of those because the physical key itself is holding onto those. When you think about passwordless token authentication and things like that, I know it's kind of not everybody's thing yet, but I think it's coming.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely not a fan of passwords or passphrases even. And you can see that with all the attacks that we're seeing. And it's not just the brute force, that passphrases might help with brute force, but the phishing sites that are out there, the social engineering capabilities that get right around this idea of, well, I need to make it a very complex password. Not to mention, I remember seeing a study a couple of years ago that like 50% of employees are using the same passphrases or passwords for their personal accounts as there is their employee accounts. And if that's the case, then that means as there's different data breaches within, consumer companies, guess what? That your employee credentials just got leaked as well. So I am all for passwordless. We have an environment like that at Akamai internally, where I grab my cell phone, I hit a button, and I'm in. Because now there was a lot of work behind that. So I don't want to kind of, it's not as simple as it's not as simple to integrate as it maybe it sounds, but it really can be that easy. And now it's, I use a password manager to remember my network password. Number one, because it's the right thing to do, but also because I don't use that password except for every 30 days I got to change it, because I'm using passwordless and kind of relying on single sign-on to get around that. So I actually think it's better for security, but it's also easier if you've implemented it correctly. I mean, I think employees would embrace that than having to keep changing, keep having to type in and then obviously as you're doing passphrases, that's a longer string that if you make a mistake on the keyboard, then you got to back up and it's like, oh, you only need to do a 16 to 20 character passphrase. And it's like, yeah, but I just messed up on key 8 or 9 and I'm not sure, I got to start over again. Passwordless is definitely an easier way to do that.
Yeah, and I know we've went back and forth as a collective from a security perspective on what even was a good reset of admin password time or a password timeout in general. It used to be the password needs to be refreshed every 90 days or every 60 days. And then we found that end users were doing what end users will do, which is write down those passwords when they refresh that quickly. When you ask them to make them more complex and refresh them more often, they're going to put them in a notebook. That's what they're going to do. And then, so I think that even in the industry is we've pulled back a little bit from that. We said, hey, if you're going to use a complex password, if you're going to do more than a dozen characters and you're going to mix those up or lower symbols, go with a passphrase. We're okay with 180, maybe a little bit longer, holding on to that password, because ideally then it's less likely to be written down or put somewhere. But I think the bigger problem is like you said, it's not about somebody seeing the password anymore. It's about somebody obtaining that password via compromise, which is I think how 90% of them are going out of the door. And it's not even necessarily compromising your own infrastructure. You can have the most secure infrastructure in the world, but if you use that same password and end user ends up using that same password on another site, and that site gets compromised, there goes that password.
Exactly. And social engineering is another one where it's they're going after the weakest link, which I think we all agree on is the individual. And phishing, I mean I've talked to several people who have like I failed my phishing, my internal phishing check because they had crafted it just a certain way and it hit me just a certain day at just the right moment where normally I wouldn't fail it. But because of what I was thinking about and everything else, I clicked the link and I know I shouldn't have. And it's like, yeah, I mean, even people, even the best security programs, humans sometimes you just catch them at the right moment, and they're going to be able to do something like that. So you can't assume that, yeah, you can't assume that like a passphrase is going to always save you. And the more complex it is, that's why I mentioned password managers. I'm a huge fan of password managers. From the end user perspective, but also from an employee's perspective, if you are in that environment where you have to track multiple complex passwords.
It's so interesting. One thing I've seen, you said you are a big proponent of the password managers, but I think the one thing I've seen a lot of that maybe now is kind of the next step in the thought process of password managers. We got a lot of people to password managers, which is I'm good. I'm happy about that. But now I think from the engineering and administrative side of things, now we're seeing it kind of be the Wild West. This person's using Google Password Manager. This person's using, Keeper. This person over here is using LastPass. So I think now what we're going to see is more of a corporatized push to say, hey, as an organization, as the IT team, we are going to provide you with a password manager so that it can be controlled and managed, and we can do what we need to do with it, lock somebody out of it, update passwords when we find that there is a site that has been compromised, things like that. So I think that's the next real wave in those password managers, is really controlled by the organization then on top of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I kind of look at it as, if the company can tell you which password manager and then also allow you a version of it for your private use, because once you start to use it, you really start to go, hey, this is great for my finances. This is great for other sites. I want this on my mobile device and I want this on my other laptop. So making sure that you have that flexibility so that they're not using multiple ones I think it makes a lot of sense from a password management perspective for a company.
Yeah, and so I know we have this starting checklist for ZTNA. I also just put in our chat today another one that I like to talk through with customers. It's called the Zero Trust Roadmap. It's a really great solution. It really goes through this roadmap. It's a little bit different than that ZTNA journey kind of slide that I showed previously. It's a little bit different than this checklist as well. But the one thing it does outline is products as well. So on each step of the journey, basically, each phase has multiple journeys or multiple points in the journey, and then as well, it's got associated applications that can be used to help fulfill whatever that line item is on that portion of the goal inside of the phase of the journey of ZTNA. So that is in the chat as well. If anybody wants to look through that or have access to that, I've a couple of customers that are probably on this call has seen me use that with them before as well. So in addition to all those logos, kind of a shameless plug for next week as we're getting close to time here. So who can help with ZTNA? Well, obviously, Sean, we'd be remiss to not talk about Akamai being able to help with that. So do you want to take a couple of minutes and maybe do a little foreshadowing here? What is Akamai offering to help with the ZTNA and microsegmentation journey? I know I've talked with a handful of customers about Guardicore. It's a product that I think is really awesome. I'm pretty excited about the fact that we now have access to offer Akamai and by extension offer Guardicore. But do you want to talk about some of the other products in your security lineup and things like that?
Sure. The Guardicore is definitely, I would say, the linchpin to our enterprise platform. Microsegmentation is just so critical with zero trust and provides so much visibility. But what we're looking at is controlling data flows and understanding data flows. So our platform, our enterprise platform, our zero trust platform is kind of the beginning of it's the Guardicore solution for microsegmentation, but it also has zero trust network access That was another product that we had called Enterprise Application Access. And we've actually managed to bring that down into a single agent with Guardicore and single policy, single console. In addition to that, we have multi-factor authentication. We use FIDO2, which is kind of the fish-proof authentication because it does take input from the browser, so it can tell that it's not the user's browser that's making that request. And then we've also got our secure internet access, which is a DNS-based solution that prevents your employees from going out to malicious websites, command and control websites, phishing websites. So really what we're trying to do is control the data flow coming into the network with the Zero Trust Network Access, the data flow going out that your employees might use to go to the internet, and then that east and west communication that Guardicore has.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, Sean can probably say that he's seen the next two logos in conversation, but another provider that will be on next week is Cloudflare. They have some very similar offerings to what Akamai can do as far as microsegmentation and some of these other items on the ZTNA journey. And as well, AppGate can do a very similar option. They tend to cover north and south traffic, and they actually have a partner that they work with, another vendor, to do east and west microsegmentation, but generally can handle that all. So with that, with a little bit of time left, I will turn it over to any questions from the audience, any items that you wanted to touch on, anything that we had, any questions we had for Sean. We'll give you a couple minutes here to just see if anybody posts any questions in the chat today. The one other thing I will say, as always, is if you want a copy of the slide deck that was offered today, please reach out to your trusted advisor from AVAIL. And if you had any questions for Sean or about ZTNA microsegmentation, you want to talk with myself and Sean, want to talk with any of these vendors about microsegmentation, please reach out to your trusted advisor as well. We'd be happy to initiate any of those calls and conversations to really go through and review where you are. I sit down with a bunch of customers and kind of understand where they are on the ZTNA journey. And then as well, just another little plug for the Talking Tech web series. If you guys are interested, check out our LinkedIn. Sarah just made a post about the playlist that we have. So we've aggregated all of the previous 6 sessions into a playlist, and we're continuing. Anytime we add a new session, it's going into the playlist as well. And then another plug would be for a new series that we're starting. It is a vendor spotlight series. Once a month, we'll be spotlighting a vendor. It will be just kind of an overview of that vendor, provided by that vendor, kind of like a little pitch on what they can do as an organization. So you'll see information about that on our LinkedIn in the coming weeks. And then as well, if you want to, feel free to post any questions in the chat. I'm not really seeing anything, so I think we are good. Sean, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
It was awesome to have you on and talk about ZTNA and microsegmentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining today.